For 175 years, every crew that ever dug on Oak Island has been fighting the same thing. A flood tunnel at Smith's Cove, built to drown anybody who got close. But here's the problem with it. Nobody has ever seen that tunnel. Not the Truro Syndicate in 1849, and not Robert Dunfield, who climbed into the bucket of a digger in 1965 and was lowered 140 feet down a flooded shaft just to see for himself.
The problem with doing this the simple way, which with a long-reach excavator, is that we do not have a stable hole. I mean, if we had dug a big pit with stable sides, then we could go down and look.
I'm going to show you every artifact that Beach has surfaced, including what Robert Dunfield found down there to convince him that nobody had ever built a tunnel at all. The beach they tore open. The men who tore that beach open never saw a tunnel either. The Truro Syndicate arrived on Oak Island in 1849 with money and confidence, and by the end of the season, they had neither. They had the same problem as every crew before them. They would sink the shaft, get down past 90 feet, and the water would take it. Not a trickle. A flood, fast enough to drive men up the ladder and fill the hole to the brim overnight. They tried pumping. They tried sinking a second shaft alongside the first and tunneling across to drain it, and the water took that one too. Then somebody noticed the thing that changed everything. The water flooding their hole rose and fell. Twice a day, in time with the tide. That isn't groundwater. That is the ocean, 400 feet away, reaching them underground. So they stopped digging down and went at the beach instead. What they pulled out of Smith's Cove stopped them cold. 2 inches of coconut fiber laid flat under the sand. Below that, a bed of eel grass. Below the grass, a course of beach rock with no sand or gravel mixed into it, which meant somebody had washed those stones before setting them down. And under all of it, the drains. 5 channels, each built from 2 rows of stone about 8 inches apart and roofed with flat capstones. They ran 150 feet along the shore, between the tide marks, and every one of them converged on a single point above the high water line. Washing stone by hand, laying 200 feet of channel, then burying the whole thing under grass and fiber and sand, isn't the work of a man with a spade. That is a crew working to a plan for weeks. Now put yourself in that trench. You have lost a season to water, and you are standing in 150 feet of hidden stonework aimed directly at the hole that beat you. They reach the conclusion you or I would reach. Someone built this to drown us. They never found a tunnel. They found the plumbing and imagined the machine on the other end of it. And if you're the kind of person who wants to know what's really on the other end, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Turn your notifications on too, so you never miss a new one. A tunnel on paper. 17 years later, the Halifax company put that machine on paper, in detail nobody had earned. 4 feet high, 2.5 feet wide, packed with round stones, running downhill at 22.5 degrees for 460 feet, from the beach to the 111-foot level of the money pit. Think about the labor in that. 460 feet of stone-lined passage, cut below sea level through wet ground, held on a constant slope with hand tools in a century with no pumps worth the name. Then the men who cut it climbed out and sealed it behind them without drowning. It's either the finest piece of pre-industrial engineering on the eastern seaboard, or it's a rumor with a tape measure. Then, in 1897, a crew swore they found the mouth of it, 111 feet down, 4 feet high, 2.5 wide, built of rock, an exact match for a description written 30 years earlier by men who never saw it. Nobody opened it. Nobody has seen it since. They were racing the tide. A shaft that fills to the brim twice a day gives you hours, and their investors were waiting on treasure, not a survey. Within days, the hole flooded and collapsed on top of whatever was down there. So the most important structure on Oak Island was glimpsed once by men in a hurry, written into a ledger, and swallowed. After that, the tunnel stopped being a theory and became the reason. Every crew that came afterwards planned around it. They walled off the beach with a cofferdam to cut the water at its source. They sank shafts wide of the money pit, hoping to intercept the passage and plug it. In 1909, a company called the Old Gold Salvage Group turned up to try again, led by an engineer named Captain Henry Bowdoin. One of its investors was a 27-year-old Franklin Roosevelt, more than 2 decades before he became president. They found the wreckage of that 1850 cofferdam. Of anything else, nothing. 70 years of engineering, aimed at a passage nobody had ever put a hand on. The man with the crane. By 1965, the island had killed 6 men. The first died in 1861 when a pump boiler burst, and still, nobody had beaten the water. Then Robert Dunfield arrived, and he came to dig rather than to argue. He was a California geologist, and he wasn't a skeptic. He believed there was treasure down there. He wanted it, and he arrived with heavier machinery than anyone in the island's history. That's worth holding on to. Almost everyone who has ever called the flood tunnel a myth was arguing from a desk. Dunfield went at it from inside the hole, and he's the only man in 2 centuries who went down specifically to find that tunnel with the equipment to do it properly. He started with the water. Spectrographic tests came back saying seawater, but not seawater from the shoreline beside the island, which was the first thing that didn't fit. So he sank his own shaft, 140 feet, straight down, into ground that had killed people. Then he lowered a television camera into it, hunting for a wall with a hole in it. The camera found nothing. Down in the bucket. He didn't accept it. A camera on a cable sees what the lens is pointed at, and a tunnel mouth choked with silt would look like more wall. Dunfield had a crane on site, an excavator, and a 140-foot hole full of black water. He got into the bucket, told his crew to lower him, and went down. Picture the last few feet of that ride. A steel bucket on a cable, a wet shaft the width of a small room, no light except what you're carrying, on an island that has already taken 6 lives. Somewhere in that wall, if 200 years of men were right, is the mouth of a stone passage 4 feet high. He rode it all the way to the bottom and looked at the walls with his own eyes, turning slowly in the bucket, 140 feet under Nova Scotia. Nothing. Bare shaft wall the whole way round. So he started measuring instead. He gauged how much water was entering from everything above him, and the number came back at 15 gallons a minute. 15 gallons a minute, in a shaft that filled itself faster than pumps could empty it. A garden hose would beat that, which meant almost every drop was arriving from somewhere below his feet. He poured dye into the sea and watched for it. If a tunnel ran from Smith's Cove to the money pit, that dye had an obvious way through and an obvious place to appear. It never showed. Not at the Cove, not anywhere along that shoreline. He was standing at the end of 2 centuries of certainty, with a set of results that pointed the other way, and he had gathered every one of them himself. What the rock was doing. In letters written in 1966, Dunfield finally set down what he thought was happening under Oak Island. The water enters through natural courses and caves, typical of the limestone and gypsum below the island. It was the opposite of what he had hoped to prove when he arrived. He was never able to stop the flooding. All he did was work out where the water was coming from, the rock itself. The east end of Oak Island sits on limestone, gypsum, and anhydrite. Anhydrite dissolves in water, and faster in salt than in fresh. Cut a shaft into that rock, let the sea reach it, and the channels widen on their own, year after year, with nobody digging anything. He wasn't guessing. Anhydrite and gypsum are among the most soluble rocks on Earth, and the ground under that end of the island is full of them, which turns the whole story inside out. Under Dunfield's answer, nobody walked into a flood trap. They dug one. Every shaft opened more rock to the sea. Every season the water came faster, and for 200 years, men fought damage they had done themselves and called it somebody else's curse. 60 years on, the search has almost entirely ignored him, and the reason is not the science. It is what he did to the island. Dunfield cut a causeway, drove that crane across it, and opened a crater so wide that afterwards nobody could say for certain where the original money pit had been. The man who tested the water properly is the same man who erased the map. That's hard to forgive, and harder to quote. The evidence kept siding with him anyway. A survey in 1995 put dye into borehole 10X and never saw it reach the coastline. Sonar found no channel, and the traditional story doesn't describe one tunnel, it describes 3, arriving from the same direction at similar depths, into a shaft 12 to 16 feet across. The story asks for 3 tunnels in a hole barely wide enough for one. Before the story began, 2018, Billy Gerhardt's backhoe opens Smith's Cove again, and this time the beach gives up everything at once. A U-shaped timber frame comes out with Roman numerals cut into the wood. Carpenter's marks. Somebody numbered those pieces so they could be dismantled and rebuilt in order, which is what you do when you're working from a plan. Then, an L-shaped wall 50 feet long and a slipway of logs lashed together like a raft with not one fastening left in it. Laird Niven, the archaeologist in the trench, notices what is missing. No iron anywhere. Colonial builders on that coast used iron the way we use screws, so either these men had none to spare, or they cut every joint out of the wood by hand. Then somebody dated the wood. Dendrochronology doesn't hand you a range. It counts a tree's annual growth, matches the pattern against a regional master sequence, and when the pattern locks, it gives you the year that tree came down. 1769. 26 years before the boy in the story ever walked into that clearing and noticed a dip in the ground. Whoever felled that timber was not hunting treasure, because there was nothing yet to hunt. The coconut fiber lying a few feet away carbon dates somewhere between 1260 and 1400, and other samples of it have come back as early as the 800s. A trap has to be built in one go, by people who understand the whole design. That beach was worked at least twice, centuries apart, quite possibly by men who never knew the others existed. Everything at Smith's Cove turned out to be real. The drains, the buildings, the imported fiber, the carpenter's marks. Everything except the flood tunnel itself. The spot nobody has dug. There's one more possibility, and it's the least romantic thing in this story. Those 5 drains match the layout of a salt works, the kind fishing crews built along that coast to run seawater into shallow pans and evaporate it. Salt was money in the 1700s. Cod doesn't keep without it. If that's what happened, then the most famous booby trap in North America is a fish curing operation, and treasure hunters have spent 175 years reading a factory as a curse. Nobody knows. Not the men who found the drains, not the geologist who went down in the bucket, and not the crew standing on that beach today. And here is the part that should bother you. 5 drains converge on one point, just above the tide line at Smith's Cove. Everybody knows where it is. It sits in plain sight, on a beach, a short walk from where the crews park their trucks. Dig it out, follow whatever runs inland, and this ends. Either a passage is there or it isn't. 3 separate crews have excavated that beach: 1849, the 1970s, and 2018. All 3 stopped short of the one spot that would answer it. Dan Blankenship came closest, uncovering part of that L-shaped wall decades before the modern team found the rest, and he spent 50 years on the island without ever digging the convergence point. The reasons are ordinary. It floods twice a day. Excavating a protected shoreline takes permits. And every crew that ever stood on that sand came for the money pit, not for the plumbing behind it. Which is how the team out there now ended up abandoning tunnels altogether and following the water straight down instead. That decision took them to a borehole they sank into the heart of the money pit expecting a chamber. It came up empty. Then, days later, a man sorting its spoil heap pulled out a hand-shaped stone projectile from a workshop that hasn't existed in 500 years. Click the link on your screen to watch that one next. And if the geology under this island is what pulls at you, the whole theory playlist is linked below. That's where every video about what's actually down there lives.